Hey kids, Flexing Teacher Weber here. I hope you're having a good day. We're going to look at more percentages today. So just to remind you what we started out doing the other day, we started out with the idea that percent means a fraction out of 100. So if we ever want to calculate the percent of something, we always want to try to make it a fraction out of 100. Now we started off with questions that were already out of 100, so it was just mental math. Like in this diagram, there's 100 squares. 4 of them are green, which means 4 out of 100 are green, or 4%. And then we got situations where there weren't 100 squares. In this one, there were 12 squares, and 3 out of 12 were red. But we could reduce it to lowest terms, 1/4, and then make 1/4 a fraction out of 100, and then use that to represent the percent. And so we did a whole bunch of questions where we made fractions out of 100 and then use that fraction out of 100 to get the percent. We're going to do more of this today, but we're going to look at some different fractions and we're going to look at decimals. So this says convert each fraction into a percent. Well, number 1, 20 out of 200. Well, percent means out of 100. Well, what could I multiply or divide by to get 200 into 100? Well, I could chop it in half to make it out of 100. And if I chop the bottom in half, then I have to chop the top in half. And I get 10 out of 100. And once it's out of 100, that tells me the percent. That's 10%. And number 2, 5 out of 500. Well, what could I do to make 500 to 100? What could I divide or multiply by? Well, I could divide by 5. 500 divided by 5 gives me 100. So 5 divided by 5 gives me 1. And 1 out of 100 is 1%. So always trying to figure out what can I do to the fraction to make it out of 100. This one is 200 out of 1,000. Well, if I want to make this a percent, what can I do to make this out of 100? Well, I could literally chop off a 0, right? And I would do that by dividing by 10. And if I divide the bottom by 10, I have to divide the top by 10. If I divide the top by 10, it's just like chopping off a 0. So this is going to be 20 out of 100. And once it's out of 100, that's 20%. And then another one, 100 out of 10,000. Well, to make this a percent, I want to make it a fraction out of 100. How could I do that? Well, I'd want to chop off 2 zeros. How would I chop off 2 zeros? By dividing by 100. And then if I do the same thing to the top, 100 divided by 100 is 1. And then 1 out of 100 is 1%. So I'm always trying to figure out what can I do to make the fraction out of 100, because percent means out of 100. Now we've been looking at how do I change fractions to percents. Let's look at decimals. Changing a decimal to a percent is really easy. To write a decimal as a percent, multiply the decimal by 100 mentally. Watch this. 38 hundredths. I want to change that to a percent. I'll multiply that by 100. And I can use mental math for this. To multiply by 100, I shift the decimal. Since there's 2 zeros on 100, I shift the decimal 2 spots to the right, It ends up behind the 8. And I would say 0 and 38 hundredths is 38%. So I'm always going to mentally multiply by 100, no matter what the decimal is. Watch this. 0 and 7 hundredths. Change that to a percent. I mentally multiply by 100. 2 zeros on 100 allow me to shift the decimal 2 spots to the right. The decimal ends up behind the 7, and I say that that is 7%. Number 3. How do I change this decimal to a percent? I mentally multiply by 100. It's the same thing every time. 2 zeros on 100 tell me to shift the decimal 2 spots to the right. The decimal ends up behind the 8, and now I'm left with 118%. And then number 3, 0 and 3 thousandths. How do I change that to a percent? I do the same thing every time. I mentally multiply by 100. 2 zeros on 100 tell me to move the decimal 2 spots to the right. The decimal is in front of the 3, so this is going to be 0.3%, or I'll put a 0 in front of that decimal, 0.3%, or 0.3%. A very small percent, a very large percent. Notice it's the same thing every time. Let's do a couple more. 0.675, 675 thousandths. To change that to a percent, I mentally multiply by 100. That causes me to move the decimal 2 spots to the right. And this would be 67.5%. Number 6, 2 and 378 thousandths. No matter what the decimal is, I always mentally multiply by 100. And since there's 2 zeros on 100, I always mentally shift the decimal 2 spots to the right. In this case, the decimal lines up between the 7 and the 8. So it's going to be 237 and 0.8%. And then number 7, no matter what the decimal is, I always mentally multiply by 100. On this one, there's 2 zeros on 100, so I move the decimal 2. It ends up right there. The problem is there's nothing in this spot. So I put a 0 placeholder, and this answer is 70%. It's the same thing every time, right? Last question. 9/10. How do I change that to a percent? Mentally multiply by 100. 2 zeros on 100 cause me to move the decimal 2. There's nothing in this spot, so I put a 0 placeholder there, and that is 90%. So there's 8 examples of how you change a decimal to a percent. Always mentally multiply by 100. And remember, to change a fraction to a percent, always make that fraction out of 100. That's all for now. That will help you with today's assignment. Flexing Teacher Weber, out.